Hello mathematicians, today's video is on Objective.116a, which is students will be able to set up and solve one-step percent problems. So go ahead and copy this objective down. Take a minute, pause the video if you need to. So we're talking today about setting up and solving one-step percent problems. And in order to do that, we're going to use something called direct translation. And so when you see direct translation, we should be thinking that we're using this for solving percent problems. We're using this to solve percent problems, okay? So let's talk first about how we're going to use direct translation. What I mean by that is we're going to take the words that we see and we're going to directly translate them into mathematical language. The first word that we're going to see is the word is. And when we see the word is, we are going to know to translate that into an equal sign. So is going to be an equal sign. Okay? When we see the word of, we're going to think multiplication. Now, we've talked previously that sometimes of can mean different things. For example, when we talked about translating expressions, of often meant to put parentheses. When we see the word of in a multiplication percent problem, we're going to know that it means multiply. So of is going to mean to multiply. Okay? Now, things like which number or which percent, those are things we're solving for. Those are things we don't know. So we're going to use a variable to represent those things. We might, for example, which number, we might use the variable n. Which percent, we might use the variable p. But we could use other variables as well. We might use an x, a y, a z, right? We can use any variable we want. Take a minute and pause the video if you need to before we kind of get into the meat of the notes. Alright, before we start going over some examples, I want you to write down a couple of just general steps to follow, and we're going to write them right over here. We have a little bit of room. When you're solving these percent problems, your first step is to direct translate. And we'll talk about what that means in a second, but that means you take what you see in words and you translate it into mathematical language. Your second step is going to be to solve for the variable. In these problems, we're going to have variables, so you're going to solve for the variable. Your third step, and this has to do with if you have a percent. If asking for a percent, if it's asking for a percent, you need to multiply by 100. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. And the fourth is that sometimes questions will ask you to round, so you need to check, do I need to round? Okay, ask yourself, do I need to round? Alright, let's go ahead and get into some examples. So we're going to come over here to example number 1. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So our first example says, 50 is what percent of 125? 50 is what percent of 125? So I'm going to directly translate this. I see the word 50, and I'm going to bring down a 50. I see the word is. Is tells me I need an equal sign, so I'm going to bring down an equal sign. What percent? That's meaning a variable. We're solving for our unknown. What percent is what we're solving for? So I'm going to use a P to represent what percent of, that tells me to multiply 125. So I have 50 equals P times 125. Now I'm going to rewrite this in a form that we're a little bit more used to, because right now P is in front of your coefficient, 125, and we normally see something like 50 equals 125p. Now what I did there was I rewrote it so that the coefficient was in front. I moved the coefficient to the front, right? And then I took out the multiplication sign. Because remember, when a number touches a variable, that means multiplication. My second step is to solve. So I have 50 equals 125p. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw my do and my undo box. What's happening to p? It's being multiplied by 125. I'm going to divide by 125. So I'm going to divide both sides by 125. 50 divided by 125 is 0.4. My 125s are going to cancel out, and I'm left with p equals 0.4. Now, our third step was to go back and say, are we solving for a percent? Okay, I circled this, but this is not our final answer. We are solving for a percent. We'll come back up to the question. It says, what percent? So we got 0.4. We need to take our 0.4 and we need to multiply it by 100 to turn it into a percent. Right now, this is just the decimal form of the percent. So I'm going to take 0.4 and I'm going to multiply that by 100. 0.4 times 100 is 40. And since we're solving for a percent, I'm going to add a percent sign to the end. So 50 is what percent of 125? The answer is 40%. All right, let's do another example. We have 75 is what percent of 300? So I have 75 here. I'm going to bring that down. 75 is, that's going to mean an equal sign. So 75 is equals what percent, okay, I'm going to use a variable to represent that, p, what percent of is going to mean times 300. So I have 75 is what percent of 300. So 75 is what percent of 300. Now again, I'm going to rewrite this so that the coefficient is in front. So 75 equals 300p. 75 equals 300p. And I need to solve for p, so I'm going to do my do and my undo box. What's happening to p? It's being multiplied by 300. How do I undo that? I'm going to divide by 300. So I'm going to divide the right side by 300. I'm going to divide the left side by 300. 75 divided by 300 is 0.25. My 300s cancel out and I'm left with p. Now, it asks us to solve for a percent. What percent? So I'm going to need to take my 0.25 and multiply it by 100. So 0.25 times 100 equals 25. Since we're solving for a percent, I'm going to add a percent sign to the end. So 25% is my answer. So 75 is what percent of 300? It is 25%. Alright, I want you guys to go ahead and try some examples. I want you to go ahead and let's try these 3 examples down here. Number 1, 2, and 3. Go ahead and pause the video. When you're ready, press play. You can see the answers. Alright, here are your answers. So for practice number 1, you should have had 119%. Practice 2, you should have had 147%. And for practice 3, you should have had 71%. Just a little bit of a note, you can see the work there, you can check your work, but I rounded all of these numbers to the nearest whole number. So you might have had something slightly different if you did not round. In general, the question will tell you whether or not to round, but in this case, I rounded to the nearest whole number. Okay, we are going to go on to the next kind of problem that you will see. So we're going to skip these next couple problems. So I want you to skip number 4 and 5 and 6. And we're going to come down to where it says example number 3. So, before we start talking about this next kind of problem that we might see, I want to talk about one key point we want to remember, and that's right here. This is going to be our key point. If you look at example 3, it says 18 is 20% of what number? When you see a percent, like 20% in the problem, you need to remember this key point over here. It says, what must you always do with any percentage before doing any calculations? In any case, you need to turn all percents into decimals. When we see a percent, that's telling us something in relation to 100. And when we're using percents in math, we use them as decimals. So, a key point for you to remember is that when we're dealing with percents, you want to turn into a decimal. Turn all percents into a decimal. So let's come back to example 3, and I'm going to erase this circle so you can see what's happening. And we're still going to directly translate. So it says 18. So I have, zoom in a little bit. 18 means equals, okay, 20%. Now, I see 20%. I'm going to need to change that into a decimal. And just as a little reminder, take your percent, 20, and put it over 100. And then we're going to divide. 20 divided by 100 is 0.2 or 0.20. So I'm going to put 0.2 in for 20%. Of means times. So I'm going to put a multiplication sign. What number, that means I'm going to use a variable. I'm going to put the variable n. So our equation would be 18 equals 0.2 times n. Now again, I'm going to rewrite this so that it has the variable in, make sure that the coefficient's in front. In this case it is. We have 0.2 times n, and I'm going to rewrite it so that we don't have the times, we just have 0.2 n. Now I need to solve for n. So I'm going to go ahead and make my do and my undo box. What's happening to n? It's being multiplied by 0.2. How do I undo that? I divide by 0.2. So I'm going to divide the right side by 0.2. Divide the left side by 0.2. 18 divided by 0.2 is 90. 0.2 cancel out. I'm left with n equals 90. Now in the previous example, we would go back up and we'd have to multiply by 100 because we were solving for a percent. If we look in this example, we're solving for a number. It's asking us what number. Since we are solving for a number, we do not need to multiply by a percent. We need to multiply by 100 to make it a percent. 18 is 20% of what number? Well, that number is 90. 20% of 90 is 18. So our answer is 90. The number is 90. So it's important to look at what you're solving for to know whether or not, am I solving for a percent? Do I need to multiply by 100? Or am I solving for a number? I can just leave it. If you're solving for a percent, you're going to have to multiply by 100 and add the percent sign to your answer. If you're solving for a number, you do not need to multiply by 100 and you do not need a percent sign in your answer. Let's go ahead and do one more example. Let's look at example number 4. It says 14 is 10% of what number? Again, I'm going to write out, directly translate. So we have 14 is means equals. 10%, I'm going to have to make that into a decimal. So again, I'm going to take 10, put it over 100. 10 divided by 100 is 0.1. So I have 0.1. Of means times. What number? I'm going to use a variable n. So my equation is 14 equals 0.1 n. Now I need to solve for n. So I'm going to make my do and my undo box. What's happening to n is being multiplied by 0.1. How do I undo that? I'm going to divide by 0.1. So I'm going to divide by 0.1 on both sides. 14 divided by 0.1 is 140. My 0.1s are going to cancel and I'm left with n. Ask yourself, am I solving for a percent or am I solving for a number? Up here we're solving for a number. So I don't need to multiply by 100 and I also do not need a percent sign on my answer. My answer is 140. Alright, I want you to go ahead and try a couple practice. So try and practice 7, 8, and 9 down here. Go ahead and pause the video. When you're ready, press play and you can see the answers. Alright, so from 7, 8, and 9, here are your answers. So number 7, you could have had n was 62.5. Number should have been 433.3 repeating. Make sure you have the point 3 repeating over your number. Notice that on all of these, we didn't need to multiply by 100 because we're solving for a number, not a percent. And also, there's no percent signs after them. A common mistake that a lot of students make is they'll start adding a percent sign. Go back to what it's asking. Okay, look at what it's asking. If it's asking you for a number, you don't need a percent sign. Alright, we are going to go through one more type of question that we might see. And so we're going to come down to where it says setting up and solving equations when given the percent and the of number. So, again, we're just going to directly translate. It says, what number is 5% of 600? So, what number? I'm going to use n. What number n is, I'm going to use equal. 5%, I have to change that into a decimal. So I'm going to have 5% over 100. Divide those out, I get 0.05. So 0.05 of 600. So n equals 0.05 times 600. Now, what's interesting is you'll notice is that the variable is already on one side for us. We don't need to solve for the variable. We just need to perform the operation 0.05 times 600. Right? If the variable is already solved for you, then you're not going to have to solve for the n itself. We don't need to do a do in our undo box. So to solve this, we're just going to say, well, n equals what is 0.05 times 600. Okay, what is 0.05 times 600? And if we perform that, we get that n equals 30. Okay, we're solving for a number. We don't need to multiply by 100. We don't need a percent sign. Our answer is just n is 30. So what number is 5% of 600? The answer is 30. Okay. All right, let's do one more example together. And this is kind of going with a word problem, and you'll do a couple of examples like this. But let's go through one together. It says, on an exam, there were 86 questions. If a student answered 88% correct, how many questions were correct? Now, this is hard to translate because it's not as simple as the one we saw before. On an exam, there were 86 questions. If a student answered 88 correct, how many questions were there? What you have to do is figure out, how can I rewrite this in a sentence like we've been seeing? How can I rewrite this as something like, what number is 5% of 600? Or would I have to write 50 is what percent of 125? Or what number is 88% of 86? Right? Which of those works? We're trying to figure out if you got an 88% and there's 86 questions, how many did you get right? What we're essentially trying to solve is 88%, what number is 88% of 86? We're trying to say, what number is 88% of 86? Okay, does that make sense? What number, correct, is 88% of 86? Now, there's a couple of things that can help us figure out which way we're going to write this. First of all, it's asking us how many questions. That means we're looking for a number. We're not looking for a percent. So that should tell us that our phrase should start out with what number. We're also looking for what percentage. We have the percentage 88. We don't need to know the percentage. So what number is 88% of our total 86? And now we can directly translate that. What number, so n, is, meaning equal, 88%. I'm going to have to place that in the decimal, so 88 over 100. That's going to give me 0.88. So 0.88 of, meaning multiply, 86. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to multiply that out. 0.88 times 86 gives me 75.68. Okay. Now, it's asking us if a student answered 88% correctly, how many questions were correct. This is a little bit tricky because we just got a decimal, and obviously they wouldn't have a decimal answer. So in general, when you get a decimal and the question's asking you how many questions you got correct, you're going to have to round. So a quick key point is that you should round to the whole number. So if our decimal was 75.68, we're going to underline the ones place, draw an arrow next door. We're going to see that we need to round up. So we get a 76, so 76%. And we can check that, too. If we do 76 questions right out of our 86 total, we're going to get 0.883. And if we multiply that by 100, so times that by 100, we get 88% if we round to the nearest whole number. So it works. All right, I want you guys to go ahead and try a couple practice problems. So go ahead and try practice 1, 2, and 3. Pause the video, and then when you're ready, press play, and you can see the answers. All right, here are your answers. So for number 1, you should have had 87.2 equals n. Number 2, you should have had n equals 412.5. And number 3, you should have had n equals 498.4. That is the end of our video. So go ahead and write down any questions that you might have and come to class ready to practice.